All right, we are here again tonight. Appreciate y'all being here with us. We are in Mark chapter 10. I apologize last week that we had a commitment that we were unable to be here for regular class. I hope you watched the video to stay up. If not, you can go back and watch it anytime. Um, I know the video is not the most exciting things, but I wanted y'all to have a class last week, so I apologize for not being able to be here in person. But last week we talked about Mark 10. We began looking at Mark 10 and looking at the halfway of the book of Mark. It's sort of interesting that we see Mark, just as we did the other Gospels, in that he covers a 3-year span of Jesus' ministry, but nearly half his book is concentrated with the last few weeks of Jesus' life. Every Gospel is this way. Majority of the books, if you look at how they're broke down, are focused on Jesus' last week in Jerusalem, his heading to Jerusalem, and then finally what happens in Jerusalem, his crucifixion. So that's sort of where we're headed, and that's what we're going to see this evening. We're going to see that Jesus has set his face toward Jerusalem and is headed that way no matter what the cost. And so we saw this last week of Jesus still teaching his disciples. They haven't quite grasped what's going on yet, and they're still having trouble. They're still having trouble tonight. They're not going to understand all this until after Jesus has died and after he's been raised from the dead, and that's what we're going to see tonight. Jesus is again going to prophesy about his death, but I think that's the first verses we read here. So let's go ahead and get started in our chapter. It's verse 32. And they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them, and they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was going to happen to him, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise." So what we see here is Jesus here is traveling, and he sets his face to Jerusalem. Now, what's interesting about this trip to Jerusalem is we see this in John and Luke, and Matthew will allude to this a little too, and don't really see it here in Mark, is that Jesus has been to Jerusalem a few times. Mark doesn't record the trips to Jerusalem, only this one, the last one. But what has happened is that Jesus has caused so much stir in Jerusalem that they know the people are looking to kill him. Matter of fact, in John 11, when he raises Lazarus from the dead, Jesus has to, well, before he raises Lazarus from the dead, he raises Lazarus on this trip where he's going to Jerusalem now. The apostles will say to each other, if he goes back, when Jesus says he's going back to Jerusalem, they say if he goes back to Jerusalem, they're going to kill him. And so this is the mindset. They know that Jesus is going to Jerusalem. And if he gets to Jerusalem, there's a group of Jews who are actively, willingly looking to put him to death, to trying to do something to him if he goes. And in their mind, if someone was trying to kill you, and again, say it for us, if you know there was someone who is trying to kill you in Tupelo, and you had your choice of where you went, we would probably choose not to go to Tupelo. No matter how much we like Tupelo, we'd find somewhere else to go and something else to do if we knew there was someone looking to kill us in Tupelo. But here we see Jesus. He not only knows that they're going to kill him, he knows one, they're trying to kill him. He knows they're going to kill him, and yet he still goes. He still goes for that purpose because he's going with a purpose. And so Jesus goes, and he knows they're all going with him. They're going up to Jerusalem. They're leaving Galilee in the north, and they're headed south. And they're headed to Jerusalem. They're going up to the city. And he noticed the people, his disciples, were amazed at what he was teaching, what he said, and what he's been telling them. And then there's others who are afraid. Now, exactly what they're afraid of, we don't know. And again, we think that afraid is they're afraid of what's going to happen in Jerusalem. They're afraid that Jesus is pushing people too far, and they don't realize what Jesus is trying to do. And again, this is another part of the Gospels that we look back at, and we try to take some of the credit away from these guys. We may not understand what they're going through. In that these 12 apostles, they don't understand what Jesus is going to do. They've never heard this concept of somebody dying and then being raised. Yes, they've seen Jesus raise people, but they've never seen somebody raised without someone, a prophet, having an action, doing something for it. So this is very unheard of what Jesus is saying is going to happen. One, he's saying it's going to happen, but two, actually seeing it happen and knowing what it is, that's really shocking to them. And so Jesus again calls the 12 to him. Now this time he calls the 12 to him again. And this is the third of the recorded accounts in Mark where Jesus predicts his death. And each time he gives a little more detail. The first time was in chapter 8. He said, we're going to Jerusalem. I'm going to be put to death. Chapter 9, I believe it is, he says, we're going to Jerusalem. I'm going to put to death, but I'll rise in 3 days. Here he gives the most comprehensive telling of what's about to happen to him. And this is something else that's interesting to me, to think that Jesus knew exactly what was going to happen to him. And this is a section of scripture that some people have a hard time with. Some people don't believe this is what Jesus really said, because Jesus predicts some stuff here. And again, us looking back at it, we don't think that much about it. But Jesus makes some very big predictions here of what's going to happen in Jerusalem. And look at this. I believe there's 7 of these that Jesus is going to predict. Notice again, he says, we're going to Jerusalem. That's where we're headed. He gives them that clear indication. There's no doubt we're going to Jerusalem. We're going to the holy city. And he says, when he gets there, the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes. The Son of Man is his description for himself, the Messiah. The Messiah is described in 3 ways. He's 3 titles. He has the Messiah, the Son of Man, and Son of David. These are 3 ways the Jews refer to the Messiah. And so Jesus is speaking of himself in that third person sense. And so he says the Son of Man is going to go to Jerusalem. And when he goes, number 1, he's going to be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes. The chief priests are going to have him. When we see Jesus betrayed, Judas is going to betray him to the chief priest. And then the second thing he says is going to happen, he says they will condemn him to death. And we're going to see that when the chief priests get Jesus. They try him that night. The next morning, they have their official case to declare Jesus guilty. And then as soon as they do that, the next thing that happens is that he says he will deliver him over to the Gentiles. And that's what we see, because the Jews couldn't legally put someone to death. Therefore, they had to give Jesus to the Romans and let the Romans put him to death. So they had to have a reason for that. And then he says, and again, that's, delivered to the chief priest. He will condemn him to death, deny, he'll be delivered to the Gentiles. The fourth thing is they're going to mock him. They're going to ridicule him. And this is both the Jews and the Gentiles. The Jews and the Gentiles both mock Jesus. There are descriptions in the gospel accounts of them covering Jesus' eyes and then striking him and saying, if you're the Son of Man, if you're the Son of God or the Messiah, tell us who struck you. Tell us who did this to you. And they spit on him. Again, there's no greater degradation, no greater humiliation than have someone spit on you. But Jesus said, this is going to happen to me. This is going to happen. And so that's the fifth thing. Then the sixth thing he says is they're going to flog him. This flogging is a beating they're going to give to him, a very brutal beating in which they would take a whip made of 9 leather tongs, and this whip would tear his back to pieces, and they'd have glass and pottery tied to the end of this whip, and it will make scratches on his back and dig into his flesh. And Jesus said this is going to happen. And finally, he says they're going to kill him. They're going to kill me. They're going to put me. They're going to condemn me. They're going to condemn me, deliver me to the Gentiles, and the Gentiles are going to kill me by cross. And so here Jesus is. Now, what's interesting about this is most people date this to maybe a few weeks to a month, maybe 2 months before his crucifixion, but yet Jesus told 7 facts about what's going to happen. Now, some people, again, who don't believe the Bible and don't think the Bible is what it is, what it says it is, don't believe Jesus is, that this was just made up by Mark. Mark put this in later because they want to deny that Jesus could predict these things. But if we truly believe Jesus to be the Son of God, there's no reason to doubt this. There's no reason to doubt that he could predict this is what's going to happen and tell them in detail, this is what's going to occur to me. And then he says after 3 days, he says he will rise. After 3 days, he's going to rise from the tomb. And again, the 3 days is not a literal 3 24-hour periods. He's going to be in the grave parts of 3 days. And that's one way of describing this 3 days. He will rise. So Jesus gives them this warning. He tells them, look, we're going to Jerusalem. When we get there, he's going to die. And then he gives details about how he's going to die. And this, again, says loads to me about Jesus and knowing just how dedicated, how sincere he was to completing this mission, that he was willing to face these hardships, face this death, and not just death, but this horrible death in order to save us, to redeem all mankind. And so Jesus tells his disciples this, and then the disciples begin to argue among themselves in verse 35. Now, again, this happens here because he's headed to Jerusalem, and he's headed to Jerusalem. And as he's headed to Jerusalem, they know he's going to, he said this is his final trip. They think that this is when he's going to set up his kingdom. And this question is, again, from James and John, who are going to ask him a question about a physical kingdom. Let's read these verses and talk about it. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. And he said to them, What do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. Jesus said to them, You do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism which I am baptized? And they said to him, We are able. And Jesus said to them, The cup that I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but is for those to whom it has been prepared. And when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. And Jesus called them to him and said to them, You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever be great among you must be your servant, and whoever be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So notice what happens here. Matthew's account tells us that James and John's mother is the one who comes to make this request. Mark says it's James and John. And again, some people say, oh, well, this is a contradiction. Not necessarily. All three of them could have been here, or James and John could have come at the behest of their mother, at the request of their mother to come here, or their mother may have been there with them. There's no reason to see these two as contradictory, and they both ask the same question. And they both say, Jesus, we want you to do something for us. Now, what's interesting about James and John is they're part of that close three. Remember on the Mount of Transfiguration, James, John, and Peter are the three that's able to go up on the mountain. They're three of the close ones to Jesus when he heals, when he raises the girl back from the dead. Peter, James, and John are the ones that are there. The other interesting thing about this is if you look at the crucifixion of Jesus, there's a description about women who are at the cross. And in the four gospel accounts, there's a list of 3 or 4 women that are at the foot of the cross. Of those women, I think there's 4. Of those women, 3 are given the same description. The 4th one is given a different description. And what's interesting, when you look at that 4th one, in one text, she's referred to as the mother of James and John. She's also referred to as Salome. She's also referred to as the sister of Mary, Jesus' mother. And so most will say if this woman is the same one, then her name is Salome. And not only that, but the key thing here is that if she truly is the same woman, then there's a good possibility that James and John's mother was Mary's sister. Therefore, she is Jesus's aunt, and therefore James and John are Jesus's cousins. So this is family. There's a good possibility, and I don't believe they are. There's a good possibility that James and John are Jesus' cousins. This is family coming up to him and saying, we want to ask you about something. We want you to take care of us when you get into your rightful place. And that's what they say. They say, we want a question for you. We want to give you something. We want you to do something for us. Jesus says, okay, well, what do you want? Again, he already knew what they wanted, but he's going to let them talk. And they come to him. They say, well, this is what we want. We want one of us to sit at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. Basically, let us be your number 1 and number 2 men. to sit at the right hand of a king, and they thought he was going to be a king. They thought he was going to be a ruler. To sit at the right hand of the king meant you were the number two man. You were the one, if the king was not in position or the king didn't make a decision, he would give it to you. A place of high authority. You were only under the king, and the other man would be the same way. So what they're asking for is they're wanting to be the top dogs in the kingdom. Next to Jesus, they want to be the top ones. And there's 12 other men or 10 other men who are vying for this same position, who are vying to get the same spot because they all think Jesus is setting up an earthly kingdom. They don't quite get what Jesus is doing here. And Jesus turns to them and says, you don't know what you're asking. You don't know what you're wanting, because he goes to tell them, he says, unless you're able, he said, are you able to drink the cup that I drink? Well, what cup? Let's talk about this for a minute. What cup is Jesus talking about here? What Jesus is talking about here, this cup, is the death he's about to go through. Is about that death he just predicted. And he says, are you able to go through that death? You remember when he prays in the Garden of Gethsemane, he says, Father, if at all possible, let this cup pass from me. That's what he's talking about here. Let this cup. And then on the cup, he talks about as baptism. And again, the idea of baptism here is this idea of being immersed, being covered. Are you able to be immersed, to be covered up, to be plunged into the hardship I'm about to be plunged into? The difficulty I'm about to experience. Are you able to go through that? And James and John, not really knowing all that entails, make that statement. Yes, we're able. Yes, we can do that, Lord. If that's what it takes, we'll do that to be number two and number three. And Jesus said, tells them, he sort of tells them, sadly, the cup that I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. Now, let's stop and talk about this for a minute. When you look at James, the brother of John, he's the first martyr. The first Christian who dies for being a Christian. Acts chapter 11, King Herod beheads him, and he gets the people excited, and he tries to get Peter. But James is the first one to die. John drank that cup. John was I believe, tarred and feathered one time, put in boiling oil, and expected to die, but he didn't. And then he got exiled, to an island by himself. He was the last apostle to live. He suffered greatly, and Jesus says, yes, you're able. You're going to drink this cup. You're going to be baptized. As a matter of fact, all the apostles, except Judas, had to drink this cup, and they were baptized in this baptism of suffering. But verse 40, Jesus says, it's not my deal, or it's not my right. It's not my ability to grant this to those people. He says, instead, it's my Father's. It's for those for whom it has been prepared. He says, it's not mine to give, it's God's. God will give it. And the idea is that in Christ's kingdom, there is no second and third in control. That we're all equal. We're all the same. And so Jesus basically tells them, you're wanting this position, but you still don't understand where I'm at. And that's where he continues. That's where the rest of this little passage continues to tell us about, is Jesus is going to again stress to the apostles about what it means to be his true follower. But you notice verse 41, when the 10 heard it, they began to become indignant at James and John. They're mad. They're furious because James and John just jumped the gun. How dare you go after Jesus? How dare you try to steal our place? How dare you try to get a one-up on us while we're not paying attention? Don't you know better than that? Don't you respect us better than that? You can just imagine how these men were acting, because they've all been following Jesus for these 3 years. They all expect that they should have these places, but yet James and John were the ones who had the nerve, the gall, if you will, to ask Jesus, let us have this place in the kingdom. And Jesus hears them. And he knows what they're arguing about, and Jesus calls them to him. And Jesus tells us a very important lesson about his kingdom. And he reminds them about this world where he says, those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. And their great ones exercise authority over them. Basically, he says the ones who are mighty, the ones who have power, they let you know they have power in the Gentile world just as our world. There are certain people in our world, in your life, you're going to meet that if they have power over you, they're going to let you know it. It could be a boss. It could be someone on a team at school. It could be someone in a class. They're going to lord it over you. They're going to let you know you're underneath them. They're going to let you know that they're more important than you. They're more powerful than you. And Jesus tells the disciples, this is how it is with the Gentiles. He says, but with you, in my kingdom, it will not be that way. But with my kingdom, that's not how it works. It's not whoever's greatest is going to exercise that authority and say, look at me and look how great I am. He says, but instead, he's going to be the servant. He's going to be the slave, the lowest of all. And also verse 44, and whoever will be the first among you must be slave of all. He must bow himself down. Again, just as in our world as in their world, again, their idea of a slave was a little different than our idea of a slave. But the idea of this slave was the lowest place you could be on earth. It was a place nobody desired, a place no one would willingly choose to be a slave unless they just had to. And Jesus says, you got to be the slave. You got to lower yourself to be the servant. Lower yourself to be the slave. Don't lord it over people. Don't say, look at me, look how great I am, look how wonderful I am, how smart I am, successful I am, how whatever I am. He says, you've got to be the servant. You've got to be willing to serve. And then he goes on to say in verse 45, for even the Son of Man, even him came not to be served, but to serve, and give his life as a ransom for many. He said, even the Son of Man, the Messiah came, the King that you're wanting to be a servant of. He said, he didn't come to be served. He came to serve. And that's a very important statement I want you to think about with Jesus. And this is something that's always been interesting to me, to think about Jesus and think about what he chose. Because I venture to say, with the way we act, the way we think, if we were Jesus and we had the ability to choose any family in all of time to be a part of, would we have chose the poor, lonely girl of Nazareth to be our mother? Would we have chosen to be born into the house of a carpenter, a handyman, a man who had physical labor, a man that we would work for ourselves, a man that we would learn his trade and do that trade for a while? Or would we choose a palace? Would we choose a king? Would we choose riches and glory and easy? The choice Jesus had. But Jesus chose Mary and Joseph to be his parents. Why? Because that was where he needed. Because he had to start at the bottom. He had to humble himself. And he realized those riches, those glory, that power could get in the way. So he says that he came not to be served. He could have been served, but he's not. He said, but he came to serve. And again, what's beautiful about this, when you put the Bible picture, the gospel picture together, is you're going to see within a few weeks of this happening, the night before, not Jesus is betrayed, they're sitting in the upper room and they're getting ready to eat. And before they ate, they had to wash feet because you just wore sandals that time and your feet would be dirty and you would be sitting on the floor and your feet would be right at somebody else's head. So you didn't want somebody's nasty feet at your head when you're eating. So what would happen in their household is a servant or a child, depending on how rich the family was, would come in and they would wash the feet. They would wash everybody's feet. Imagine that for a minute. Imagine if in your house, when you had company come over to eat at your house, whether it was family or a guest, whatever it was, that before anybody could eat, when those guests come in the house, they had their sandals and all their roads were dirt, their feet were nasty. You know how your feet get on a summer day. And imagine before you could eat, every night before you could eat, you had to get down and wash their feet. That's how this was. And that was this job. And what we see in the upper room, this is in John 11 or John 12 and 13, is the apostles, none of them want to bow down and wash feet until Jesus gets up. And Jesus gets up, it says, and takes his robe off, wraps a towel around his waist, and he begins to wash their feet. The master, the one who should have been head of all, the one who should have been respected above all the others, he's the one who bowed down and cleansed them. He's the one who bowed down and washed their feet, thus teaching them a lesson, this lesson, that they need to be a servant. And that's a lesson for us to learn, is that in being a Christian, it's not about us. And that's what turns a lot of people off about Christianity. True Christianity is not about us, not about what we want, what we think, what we desire. It's about serving others, looking after others. That part of the idea, and calling others to the church, or getting others to, telling others about Christ, is telling them to serve them, to let them know who God is and what he's done for them. And he knows Jesus says, lastly, to give his life as a ransom for many, to pay the cost. Well, what cost? Well, the cost was not to Satan, but to God. He paid the cost to appease a righteous God, a just God who had to be appeased, had to be paid because there was sin. You see, we all have sin in our lives. We all have sin. We all have messed up. And there's nothing we can do to redeem it. It's only by a pure, perfect sacrifice that we can be brought to peace with God. And that's what Jesus said he came to do. To cleanse and to redeem, to ransom, to pay the bill for every person who's ever lived, every person who was before him and every person that's after him. And Jesus says this was his goal. This was his mission. And therefore, he tells his disciples, don't be after yourself. Don't be after your own honor. Don't be after your own well-being, but look after those around you. Be a servant. Take care of those around you. And then finally, we see Jesus being that servant. In the last few verses, last 5 or 6 verses here of Mark 10, we see verse 46, and they came to Jericho. Now, Jericho's about 6 miles from Jerusalem. They're getting close. And they came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus stopped and said, call him. And they called the blind man, saying to him, take heart, get up, he is calling you. And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, what do you want me to do for you? And the blind man said to him, Rabbi, let me recover my sight. And Jesus said to him, go your way. Your faith has made you well. And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. Now, notice what Jesus is doing. He's come to Jericho. I said he's down near Jerusalem. And as he's getting ready to leave Jericho and with his disciples and a great crowd, he passes by a blind beggar. Now, let's understand the idea of a blind beggar. In Israel, if you were blind, and if you were mute, if you were disabled, there was no work, there was no Social Security, there was nothing to take care of you. You had to depend on the generosity of others. And one of the things the blind would do, and the disabled would do, the handicapped would do, is they would have someone lead them out early in the morning, every day, to the side of the road. And they would sit by these city gates. Now, the city gates was the way you went in and out of the city. And there's most traffic, or they would find a popular building and they would sit by the road and they would sit there all day with a cup or a plate, and they would sit there and beg people to give them some money, beg people to give them just a little bit. And again, in the ancient world, what you would do is you would get your money and then you would go that night and buy the bread to eat for dinner and for the next day. And if you didn't get money during that day, if you didn't get paid during the day, you didn't eat that night. You didn't eat the next day. So he was sitting on the roadside. He's sitting beside the road with all these other beggars around, we would assume, that are here. Matthew tells us there's actually 2 of them here, but Bartimaeus is the main one, who are begging for money. And as they're saying that, you can imagine sitting here being a blind man, you can't see, but your hearing's going to be good. And you hear this loud commotion. You hear this big crowd of people. Jesus is coming with his 12 apostles, and this great crowd is following with them. And he begins to ask, who is it? Or he listens. We don't know. He somehow finds out it's Jesus. Now, what we do find out is he knows who Jesus is. He knows what Jesus has taught, what Jesus has done. And so we see blind Bartimaeus when he finds out. Now, the other thing about Bartimaeus, before I get on this, sorry, I skipped something here. It's interesting. It calls him Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus. If you look at the end of Bartimaeus' name, he has the name Timaeus in it. What Bartimaeus means in Greek, bar means son of, and then Timaeus is who? So his literal name is son of Timaeus. Imagine having that name for a minute. Imagine being called the son of whoever. Imagine if Sophie was called the daughter of Billy. That was what her name meant, was daughter of Billy. We may get a little kick out of that, but that's what Bartimaeus' name meant, son of Timaeus. So he was recognizable. And I say that to say this, is that this is one of the few men who are healed, who's given a name. And what some people think may have happened is that Bartimaeus was a major part of the church when it was established. It's going to be established in just a few days, about 2 or 3 months from this point. Bartimaeus may have been a part of the early church, and therefore Mark included his name so those people in Jerusalem would know the story of Bartimaeus. Again, that's just a thought. We don't know 100%, but there's a good likelihood of that. And so Bartimaeus hears that Jesus is coming. Now, Bartimaeus knows who Jesus is, knows what he's able to do, knows that he's the Son of God, knows that he's the Messiah, has heard all the rumors. Again, staying on the side of the road, he's heard all the rumors back and forth. You imagine, again, going back to your school, I don't know how it is now, but with this coronavirus, but you know how it used to be, that if you stood in the hallway of your school and you listen and you saw people walk by you, you'd hear all kind of little parts of conversations. That's how it would have been set on the side of the road. Bartimaeus would have heard all kind of stories about Jesus. And when he finds out Jesus is there, he cries out with a loud voice, cries out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Now, he calls him Son of David. Son of David, as I said earlier, was one of the 3 terms for Messiah. There is the Messiah, or there is Messiah, Son of David, and Son of Man. He recognizes, calls out to Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of David, that predicted son who is sitting on the throne of David. He cries out to him, Jesus, have mercy on me. And again, the idea is not that he just cried it out one time and stopped. He continually cried this out to try to get Jesus' attention, this great crowd. And the people that are nearby begin to tell him, shh, be quiet. We can't hear. Listen. Now, what they're doing for this, you may say, well, why do they act this way? Well, what would happen when a teacher had his disciples on a road as they traveled is he would teach them as they walked. As they walked, he would give instructions and he would teach his disciples. So it's thought that Jesus was probably teaching here and speaking to his apostles and this crowd as they went down the road. And the people are trying to hear him, but they can't hear him because Bartimaeus is over here yelling in the corner. This blind man is interrupting everything. He's still sitting down on the ground and he's yelling out probably top of his lungs, crying out to Jesus. And they try to get him to be quiet, but notice he cried out all the more. He kept crying out, Son of David. Son of David, have mercy on me. Son of David, heal me. See me. Listen to me. And they try to get Bartimaeus to be quiet. And then you notice verse 49, Jesus stopped. And Jesus says, call him. And it's interesting. You don't see Jesus say, call the blind man. Call who yelled at me. Who did this? He just says, call him. Call the one who just yelled. Call the one who's on the side of the road. And so they come to him. And they say, take heart, feel good, get up. He's calling you. He heard you. He's going to listen to you. He's going to hear you out. And this has been a major thing for a rabbi or a teacher to stop and acknowledge a blind man. And you see this in Bartimaeus, verse 50, that he throws off his cloak. And again, he had been sitting down and used his cloak like we may a blanket. And he throws it off and jumps up and he comes to Jesus. Now, he comes as quickly as he can because he's excited. And Jesus says, what do you want me to do for you? What would you like me to do? Why did you call me out? Why did you yell for me? And he says, teacher, let me recover my sight. Now, this tells us something about Bartimaeus. Bartimaeus was a man who had lost his eyesight in his life. Because it doesn't say, let me have eyesight to begin with. Let me recover it. Let me get it back. Meaning he had it at one time. And he lost it because of something. And now he's got it back. Now, another thing about this, and I want to give you this because this is a loaded response, because in ancient Israel, in the ancient world, they thought that if you went blind, that was a punishment from God. If you were born blind, that means your parents sinned or you sinned. They'll ask Jesus that question in other places. Or if you were older and you went blind as age went on, something happened, no matter if something happened or not, if you went blind, they thought you were evil. You had sinned. You had messed up. And again, we talked about that. They didn't have the best hygiene. They didn't take the best care of each other. And so going blind was not unheard of, not something totally bad. And so, or not something out of the ordinary. And so this could have been, this man could have been looked down upon because he's blind. And, oh, well, what sin has he done? And now he comes to Jesus and says, Jesus, I want my sight back. Please help me recover my sight. And this tells us he believes that Jesus could heal him. He's heard about Jesus' healing, not just his teaching, but his healing. And Jesus tells him, go your way. Go home. Go about your life. Your faith has made you well. Now notice this, your faith has made you well. How did it make him well? Because he was willing to cry out to Jesus. He was willing to yell and get Jesus' attention. He wouldn't let Jesus pass him by because he needed Jesus. He had a hope, a dream that maybe Jesus would do something. And Jesus said, your faith has made you well. And we see his faith because notice the next part, and immediately he recovered his sight. Immediately, as soon as Jesus said it, there's no delay, there's no hesitation. His sight comes back to him. And then he followed him on the way. Bartimaeus begins to be his disciple. He begins to travel with Jesus. Imagine that for a minute. Imagine having a man who's been sitting on the side of the road for years, we would assume, who's now part of your crew, who now travels with you. And imagine what that must have been like, because Jericho was a big town. Imagine what that must have been for the people who traveled through Jericho, who saw Bartimaeus sitting on the side of the road, who knew his story, who knew he was blind and knew he was begging. And now he's up, and he's not just up, but he can see. It's very clearly just noticeable that he can see, and he's following Jesus. What another great testimony about what Jesus can do. And here again, Jesus has compassion. He has mercy on a man who didn't necessarily deserve it, but a man who had the faith to cry out to Jesus, to ask Jesus to hear him, to ask Jesus to respond, to ask Jesus to do something. Again, remember, Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. He's on his way to his end. And even in the end of his life, he was still willing to serve. Again, remember what we talked about a minute ago. Jesus said, I came not to serve, not to be served, but to serve. And so here we have this beautiful story in Mark 10 about Jesus's teaching his disciples about what it means to be his true follower, about what it means to truly be like him, to be willing to, one, give your life away, to two, be a servant for all, and then to look after others as well as yourself. And that's the story we can learn here. That's the lesson we can learn tonight from this passage, is that Jesus wants us to be that servant. He wants us to care, and we can do that. We can do it easily. It's not the easiest thing to do, but it's something we can do if we're willing to try. So as we take this to heart and we keep looking at this idea, let's think about one, that Jesus was that servant, that Jesus was one who's willing to serve and help us however he could, and help us to become saved, to have redemption. And he asked us to do the same thing. And again, he's not asking us, and this is one of the most interesting things to me about this, he's not asking us to do something that he himself wouldn't do. And so the least we could do is to help those around us. That's all for tonight. Appreciate you being here. Appreciate you joining us. We hope to see you next week as we pick up here in chapter 11. Thank you for being here tonight, though, and we'll talk to you later.